Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is the online version of PAIRS 2026. This is also an official pre-summit event of the India AI Impact Summit, which is to be held in Delhi from 16th February to 21st February. This is the second edition of PAIRS. The first edition took place in Paris and the sidelines of the AI Action Summit, each summit, new verb. But the objective is to make sure that we're talking about participatory AI research and practice, as the name suggests, and explore what are the mechanisms, whether it's in practice, whether it's in policy, whether it's in process. How do we make sure that participation of citizens of different voices of communities is part of the agenda, and make sure that inclusion and social empowerment are not sidelined. We will be talking through some of the paper presentations, but what we wanted to also focus on very quickly was the India AI Summit as well. I'm going to be joined by Jhalak Kakkar, who is the executive director of the Communication Governance Institute at NLUD Delhi, and we are going to just talk through the idea of what is. So this is, as a lot of people know in the room, is the second summit, or is the fourth summit, and the first one in the global south. I heard a very helpful analogy, and I wonder if this is a useful one. But that this is the first summit in the global south, and it'll be like the football World Cup, where we never thought that it would be possible to have summits and World Cups in the global south. But now, with this one, we hope that this is going to be a mushrooming of more summits. But then the question of what is the value? How do we make sure that this doesn't become just another conversation where we don't have the space to really influence the narrative or agenda, but also where we draw more value from this moment, geopolitically, multilaterally, and then obviously through communities. I think Jhalak is on the call, but if I may call on Jhalak to just walk us through a little bit more about the India positioning, what does AI impact mean, and how do we think about both where the summit is going to take us, what is the role of Global South, and how do we think about participation in the context of the summit?
Thanks, Astha.
Go
Sorry.
ahead, Jalak, please.
Thanks for having me, Astha, Tim, and I'm so pleased to join this event that Pairs is organizing. I think instances and events like this are exactly what we need along the sidelines of summits to ensure that we attempt to create sustained space for civil society and academic thinking. I think the biggest challenge before us is then how do we bridge the thinking that's coming out in these spaces and really feed it into perspectives and ideas that governments and industry are developing. So industry in terms of the policies that they are setting, decisions they make, and governments in terms of, regulations, legislative frameworks, and sort of industrial policy that they set. As you know, we had the first summit at Bletchley Park, the second one at Seoul, and the third in Paris, and we've seen an evolution in the focus of themes, with Bletchley Park really being on existential risk, frontier risk, to Seoul, which was of course a lot more low-key, sort of looking at, okay, how do you set up international coordination and institutional mechanisms to operationalize and discuss questions of safety. And then the Paris Summit was the AI Action Summit, where I think they were purposely trying to move away from the idea of these sort of faraway risks to the here and now. And in some ways, they were successful in the fact that they developed the public interest AI narrative, but in some ways, they were less successful for really being able to put maybe some of the governance and human rights questions squarely on the table. With India coming into the fray and hosting, the next summit, it's really been a pivotal moment where the global South has the opportunity to sort of center the issues and concerns topmost on mind, whether it's concerns and questions of access to sort of AI infrastructure, or concentration of where these technologies are being developed. Um, to really, India's doing it in an interesting moment of geopolitics, where in many ways it's caught between the US and China. India's really, chosen the word impact summit in and there could be many different explanations for it. I've heard many different explanations, but the one that you hear often from the government is really India wants to focus on the creation of applications uh, of AI that are truly useful to the common person and can transform and enable inclusive development. So that sort of seems to be the focus on one hand. But I think, if you look at really the themes of the summit and what the Indian government is calling the chakras of the summit, it's a focus on human capital. It's a focus on inclusion for social empowerment. It's a focus on safe and trusted AI. It's a focus on resilience, innovation, and efficiency. It's a focus on science. It's democratizing access to AI and AI for economic growth and social good. And many of these themes sort of go feed back into that inclusive development conversation, into the geopolitics of the moment where you want to democratize access to AI resources. It feeds back into internal priorities we've seen with the India AI mission, where they've really been focusing on creating AI infrastructure, getting access to compute, creating data sets with India Post, creating data sets to support the development of multilingual models like Bhashini. There is, you can definitely see that feeding between sort of internal priorities and then what is being projected during the summit. Um, but I think, one sort of cross-cutting theme is definitely the question of global South leadership. I think what is not, while we have a theme on safe and trusted AI, which in many ways perhaps is the nomenclature or the term of use to sort of talk about governance at a moment geopolitically when it's not very safe for countries to talk about governance, because then it's hard to get the US to the table the moment you talk about it. But I think for me, that's one of the biggest gaps I see in the way the summit conversations are evolving, is that we're really not talking about the effective governance of AI as a technology. And by that, you don't necessarily, have to jump to the extreme end of, heavy-handed governance, but even sort of light touch governance, so that we don't repeat the social media sort of story that we saw, where for 10 years, 15 years, we were completely hands off. And then, when there was a Cambridge Analytica, suddenly we all woke up and we're like, oh, we didn't even realize there are these harms. Oh, we didn't realize the business models sort of promote like, are anchored to user engagement, and hence it prioritizes certain kinds of negative content. It has impact on our society culturally, socially, on our information ecosystems. So I think there is a need to for us to sort of refocus back to the governance question. And I think that's really the role that civil society academia has to play in the context of the summit. It's been a mixed bag in terms of the space that civil society and academia have been sort of given. In many ways, there have been sort of a lot of space for civil society and academia to be hosting a lot of events, having accredited events, working groups, though with government membership, have done consultations with civil society and academia. But I think the question really for us is, how do we sort of ensure that the questions that are important to us, where we are centering the user in all of this and talking about harms and impacts on users. How do we really translate that to governments and industry and ensure that the evidence-based research that many of us are undertaking in academic environments is really reaching them and helping them make effective decisions on how to approach AI as a technology. And I think that is really the question before us. And it needs sustained engagement for civil society networks and academic institutions to not only with the India Summit, but summits of the future, continue to engage with governments to create structured spaces, mechanisms that are built into the design of these summits to really open up the space. With the India Summit, of course, many civil society and academic organizations have applied to host events at the main summit. I'm sure many of them will have that opportunity. So that is sort of one way. But what may be nice in future summits is to really see that civil society academic track coming in for them to come in and be part of some of the conversations that are happening at the high level. I'm going to Asta. I'm sure you're going to tell me to start wrapping up, so I'm going to sort of start that process now. I think I'm so pleased that Pairs and Astha and Tim and the great program committee has really facilitated this exchange of views. Doing it online to be more inclusive, doing it in person in Delhi, in the context of the week of the AI Summit. It's so important for us to be coming together. And I'm sure even within civil society and academia, so many of us have a fairly wide array of perspectives, and not all of us agree. But I think that's the beauty and the fun of these kind of academic and research exchanges. So the very best to all of you, and really enjoy the evening or the morning or the afternoon, from depending on where in the world you are plugging in for. And for those of you who will be at the summit, really look forward to meeting many of you at the Pairs event on the 18th of February. Thank you, Asta. Thank you, Tim, for having me today.
Thanks so much, Jhalak. I know you're dialing in from Goa, so especially thankful that you could make it. As Jhalak mentioned, this is an evolving story and one that we've all been watching very closely, from safety to now impact, and then to a global South role, which we're all trying to untangle in terms of what it really means and where we can exercise a little bit of that agency that we desire in this discourse. But I'll pass it back to Tim to take us to the next step of the programming. I'm excited to hear the presentations.
Wonderful, thank you. So thank you, Jalek, for kind of setting the scene. I'm actually going to take us back a moment to a few bits of housekeeping and welcome and tell you a bit about Pairs as well. So as we said, this session's being recorded, and as an official summit pre-event, we'll be sharing a short report of some of the themes today as an input into those summit dialogues. There is a collaborative note document that we'll post the link to in chat. So in a moment, I'm going to invite you all to introduce yourselves in there. At the moment, you can turn your video on but not unmute just while we're doing the panel components, but later on in our discussions when we get to questions, I'll set it so anyone can come in on voice, as this is a conversation for us all to be having together, really around, as we prepare for the Impact Summit, as we prepare for Pairs, what are the messages we want to be making sure are put onto the agenda. So our plan for the rest of this morning, afternoon, evening, depending on where you are, is just to finish a bit more background to Pairs and the Impact Summit and so on. Then we've got two panels for you where some of the people who'll be presenting full papers or presentations next month are going to give you the 3 or 4 minute teaser. We make Pairs tough. First we tell people take all your research, compress it to 10, 15-minute presentations. Then we say compress that down to just 4 minutes for the preview event. But to get us thinking about where are those spaces where participatory approaches need to be put on the agenda, but also where are the challenges to doing that. After that, we'll come to some breakouts, which if you're able to still join us, will then give us a chance to really collaborate together on those core messages. So what I am going to invite everyone to do for an awkward 3 or 4 minutes of silence online and a lively saying hello to people physically in the room is just in the collaborative document we have. Hopefully it is editable for everyone. I'm seeing people are editing it. If you get a view-only version, maybe hit refresh or just check edit is at the end of the URL. And if that doesn't work, just introduce yourself in the chat. But just so we can get a sense of who's here, add yourselves, look at who else is here. We'll take 2 minutes to do that. I'll mute from here, so in the room I can ask people to say hello to each other as well. And then we'll be coming to our panels in a few moments. All right, so do carry on introducing yourself in that document. Hopefully that just gets us practiced using that. The record of today will both be the recording, but also anything you put into this document as well. So you've already heard a bit about pairs. I want to introduce the team that kind of make it. As has been mentioned, there's a program committee, Asta and myself co-chairing, but many people, some of whom are here, some have not been able to join us today, who've been helping us shape this event, and many supporting organisations. Pairs emerged as a small idea at the AI Action Summit last year and kind of outstripped our expectations, just realising the wealth of work that is going on to say affected communities should be at the heart of AI development from all sorts of directions, from people inside industry, in academia, at grassroots, who are approaching this as pro-AI development, wanting to shape it, approaching this, challenging the impact of AI on local communities, and approaching from spaces of resistance as well. And we wanted to build that broad space where those things can be in conversation with each other through tracks on AI development, governance, and on power. And our goals really in this are sharing practice, showcasing research, fostering dialogue, and originally field building, but building fields. There's overlapping fields of practice here that we want to try and bring together through the work we're doing. And we recognise we're one part of a much wider set of groups who are thinking about the voice of affected communities in AI. You've heard a bit about the India Summit. And we're really going to be keeping in the back of our minds, or the front of our minds today, what are the messages in the run-up to that summit that the participatory practice and research community wants to put forward. But I'm really pleased to say, as of last night, the full draft programme for our events on the 17th and 18th of February are now online. There were 120 submissions. We accepted, the Pairs community obviously just want to see this work shared, so almost accepted everything. We had to make some really hard judgments just because of space, but about 75 presentations and 20 posters that will be happening over 2 days of programming online on the 17th of February and in Delhi on the 18th. You can now find the agendas online. And also, as we recognise this is an ongoing conversation, we do now have a Discord chat space that really will invite you to join us in the run-up to those events and beyond. So that was really all the preamble, and that gets us ahead of schedule to come to our first panel, which is to look at questions of different perspectives on participation. It's a term that's used in many different settings. There's many different parts of, for want of a better term, the AI value chain or supply chain or impact kind of journey where participation can feature. And the presenters we have now are looking at this from a lot of different angles and perspectives. And what I'm going to invite them each to do, without too much introduction to them, is to just tell us in 4 or 5 minutes about the work that they're bringing to pairs, what they've been thinking about, and then we'll go to some questions that I'll put to them, and then open to questions from everyone online and in the room. So without much further background, I would love to come to our first inputs for that, Nathan Matthias and Megan Price, on public involvement improving the science of AI. And if everything works, you should be able to unmute yourselves, and I'll spotlight you to speak.
Hi, everyone. It's so exciting to see you all. I'm Nathan Matthias. I'm a professor at Cornell University, and I do a lot of participatory science alongside communities on questions involving collective behavior and artificial intelligence. Megan?
Hi, same. I'm so happy to be here and be in this conversation. I'm Megan Price. I'm the executive director of the Human Rights Data Analysis Group. We call ourselves HRDAG, and we do a lot of collaborative work with communities, typically who would describe themselves as organizers or activists. And so we are the technical experts who bring a lot of these scientific tools and work very closely with our community partners to achieve their advocacy goals.
Thanks, Megan. About a year and a half ago, Megan and I were spending some time together as scientists and statisticians, and we realized that while we are advocates for participatory work, participatory governance, and participatory science, we often see people argue for this work from the perspective of why it's good for people and why it's good for democracy. And we often face questions and critiques from our fellow scientists and statisticians, and sometimes people who don't want to listen to communities who say it's bad science, that working with the public makes the work less reliable, less rigorous, less valid. And we don't actually think that's the case. Our, combined many years of work in this space has shown us how actually the science can be better. So we decided to write an article, which has been published in the Proceedings of the National Academies of Science, summarizing this debate and arguing why we think this is actually important if you care about science and rigor.
Yeah, and so just to give sort of a very brief outline of what we'll talk about more at the pairs event is that we really relied on the rich and deep literature that already exists from this community, many of whom may be here doing a lot of this participatory work. And so we described first, we kind of set the stage for why it's so important to evaluate various AI tools and some of the stakes that are at play with the kinds of socio-technical problems that some of these tools are being applied to. And we talked about the need to assess reliability and to look at the performance of these tools in context, and then, of course, security and transparency.
In the paper, we also try to summarize different models of public involvement in AI research that we've seen out there. On one end of the spectrum, there's this contributory model where data is collected from people or people donate data in a very highly structured way, defined by researchers or developers, all the way to this co-created idea where communities are directly involved in the design of the evaluations of systems and the design of the methods of doing so. We also wrote a little bit about participatory governance, which all of you probably know far more about than I would. And the central notion of lived experience expertise. How do we think about the expertise that people bring by merit of who they are and what they've experienced, and how that comes together with the expertise of training and professionalism that is an important part of the conversation as well. Megan?
And then we just wanted to outline some of the concerns that we had heard expressed in some of the conversations we had and really summarize the state of the literature on some of the research into those concerns. And so we address things like the divide between theory and application, especially in some more technical computer science fields. we addressed that some people worry that introducing community participation introduces subjectivity that can weaken the rigor of the science, and again, summarized kind of the state of the research into how that's actually playing out. And then again, the concern that public participation can potentially reduce the reliability, which research has shown is not so much the case. And then, of course, the cost and the pace and the scale of including community participation, and that I think is one of the tensions that we probably feel the most, and that we kind of spend a fair amount of time kind of talking about. Nathan?
Yeah, our article wraps up by describing and also sharing some case studies of areas where we actually think the science of AI evaluation can be improved with participation, and we include stories from our own experiences. And this was really fun, Megan, to hear stories from HR DAG. One is people don't believe it's possible for like disagreeing groups to come together around the data. But it's possible and actually can make the science better. Measurement, like how do you actually know you're measuring what you care about? There's a conversation about explanation in AI, which we unpack, inference and how you draw conclusions, and also interpretation. And I really appreciate learning about examples from HR DAG's work on, auditing algorithms in the public sector, analyzing data from mass violence and atrocities, as well as studying police records. We also looked at some of Cat Lab's work on like understanding and preventing online harassment, auditing algorithms for discrimination, and looking into interplays between recommender systems and misinformation. So there's a range of examples where we look at the details of the science and ask how participation shaped them. Ultimately what we tried to do with this paper, and we hope it'll be helpful to you and we'll learn from you, is to produce something that when people have questions, when they doubt whether participatory work could make a difference and produce high quality work, have a resource that helps all of you say, actually, here are some ways that can be better science. And as you all, and as we all try to do better work that is more authentically engaging with communities and produces better evidence, we're able to learn from each other in some of the best practices that we surfaced from almost 200 papers from across the field. So we're excited to learn from folks in the Paris conversation as well.
Wonderful. Thank you, Megan and Nathan, for setting us up so well with that piece of work. And one of the reasons I wanted to open with that as well is it really looks strategically at how would we create a bigger supply chain of people who are thinking about participatory science, the giving academics the cover to say this is part of what we do. So that strategic use of research, as well as outlining all those issues for us. I'm not going to unpack much more, put questions now, but for people who do have questions for panelists, please use the collaborative doc. We'll post the link again. And if I can ask some people who are watching the chat, if you see questions in chat, pop them in the doc so that when I come to the Q&A, we've got a sense of what's on the table. But we're going to come next to Amin. Again, if I ask you to unmute yourself, I've got your slides here. And Amin, I think, is going to take us to a very different end of this landscape of participatory AI.
Thanks, Tim. Thank you, everyone. It's really nice to get a chance and present some of the work that my colleagues and I have been doing around a very specific sectoral use of AI, or like the proposed use of AI. So I'm Amin Johar. I work as a data governance lead with this international nonprofit organization called CABI. My co-authors are Elliot Jones and Samuel Coggins. Unfortunately, neither of them was able to join me today for this preview event. But we all, in the last few years, I come from a law and policy background, and I've been interacting with issues of data governance and AI governance for a while, including a significant chunk of work around participatory approaches to AI. Elliot and Sam are a lot more focused on digitization in the agricultural and agricultural development sector. and our work has intersected a lot in the last 18 months or so. So we decided to put some of those ideas into this presentation and put forward like a critique of some dispositions and some ideas that have been floating around when we talk about the use of AI systems in agriculture. The reason we've chosen ag dev is, of course, our professional background sort of brings that expertise to the table, but also agriculture is increasingly becoming a core focus area for AI innovation and AI deployment, especially in national strategy documents and AI roadmaps of global South countries. A lot of South American, African, and Asian countries actively talk about the use of AI innovation in agricultural advisory, weather prediction, soil health, etc. So we see a lot of interest from governments and public sector stakeholders to promote this technology. And we felt a lot of innovation is already happening, and it is couched in terms of large scale transformative impact to the sector for the better. But on the ground implementation often does not fare as promisingly as it is portrayed to be in the text of such documents. So our hypothesis is that a key reason why implementation of this technology and its scaling falters in sectors like agriculture is because it's a very top-down approach by governments or by certain sort of actors in the ecosystem. There's a lack of sort of trust and capacity within the end users or the proposed end users of these technologies. And a key factor towards that trust deficit is because they do not have a lot of interaction in the actual process of the formulation of this technology, or like the governance behind or the reasoning or the rationale behind why this technology is being deployed in certain use cases of the agricultural sector. We can go to the next slide. So I think like our presentation, when we do present it on February 18th, is going to fundamentally tackle the question of not whether participation in theory is happening in agricultural AI, but more importantly, show how it is happening in practice, whether these participatory approaches are well-intentioned but structurally flawed, and the scope and conditions under which this participation takes place. So yeah, we go to the next slide. Yeah. So we've basically, for this preview, we have looked at a very limited set of selected papers. And the idea was to essentially focus on a small set of analytically rich cases where participation is central and is being talked about as like the core focus of those research papers was around participatory approaches and how to improve citizen participation and the deliberation of AI systems. But at the same time, yes, we wanted to critically examine them. So we've basically examined a small set of papers and tried to measure the efficacy of the participatory frameworks in that using 2 or 3 metrics. We can go to the next slide. Yeah. So the 2 or 3 metrics that we've looked at are like we've basically looked at 3 sort of complementary frameworks. The first one is a 4-factor test by Gloria Miller, which is essentially used for identification of participants. So her 4-factor test talks about power, legitimacy, urgency, and harm. And based on the like, if 2 or more of these factors are aligning with a particular individual or an entity, then that individual or entity should be deemed as a relevant participation and should be engaged with meaningfully. The second metric that we're using is the scope or the degree of participation. And here we are relying on something which is more of a legacy framework, but I feel is still very relevant, which is Sherry Arnstein's ladder of citizen participation. Broadly, that ladder is divided into 3 main categories, although there are like 8 different rungs in total. So the 3 categories are non-participation, tokenistic participation, or actual citizen engagement and empowerment. And we wanted to see if we could evaluate the frameworks that are being put forth in these 4 papers that we've identified, and sort of measure them on those different rungs and determine where those participatory approaches would fit in our assessment. And the third is the objective of participation. This is more in terms of so in addition to identification of the right participants and the degree of participation, I feel the objective of participation is also a crucial piece that comes across in some literature, but not often in the papers that we've reviewed, particularly in the agricultural context. And objectives are important because what we found in a lot of the papers we were reading is that participation is talked about. We can also go to the next slide because this sort of fits there. Sorry, the slide before. I'm sorry. But a lot of the participation is termed as feedback loops, where it is basically after the AI system has been designed, deployed, and then you bring in certain kinds of participation or end user feedback to iteratively improve your model. Whereas I think what we want, and a lot of that is determined by the end objective of that participation. So in a lot of instances, we see that participation is basically to gather end user feedback because it is improving the commercial viability of an AI model in the agricultural sector, whether it is like a generative AI model, etc., or whatever it is being used for. It is not necessarily with the objective of actually empowering citizens to delve and interact more deeply and in a more nuanced manner with the power structures and the decision making process. So this is the third metric, and the way we are conceptualizing it in our final paper is we're trying to bridge the three metrics and basically create like this sort of analysis matrix where we want to assign a score based on the 3 metrics to a proposed framework and basically create like a uniform sort of scoring mechanism that allows not only in the agricultural context but in other contexts also a person to realistically and critically evaluate the efficacy of a participatory model. So yes, we are drawing from agricultural research and agricultural AI research, but we are hoping that the end sort of matrix that we create is more sector agnostic and is more flexible in its usage. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you, Amin. And I think that really takes us to that question of, those questions you're posing of the structural context, the political context, the power context, all those elements of evaluating from ideals to instantiation how this is working. And to close off our opening session on these different ways of looking at participatory AI, I'd like to come to Dr. Humpington to share with us the work on looking at trustworthy AI in that last mile. Over to you.
Sure, Tim. Tim, can I share the presentation from my screen?
Yes. Do you have?
Yeah.
You should have screen share.
Yes. Yes. Just a second.
You've got about 6 minutes or so.
Yeah. Can you see?
Yes, that's showing now.
Can you see? Yes.
Yeah, we can see
Hello.
the presentation.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much for this opportunity, and very honored to be here to present our work from Global South from India, which is hosting the AI Impact Summit. Fun fact to start with is that 70% of India is rural. So when I speak about how to build a community-centered developmental framework, it comes from our 25 years of experience of working with rural India. So we go to our first slide. Artificial intelligence is increasingly shaping governance, communication, and livelihoods across the Global South. At the same time, prevailing models of AI innovation remain very technocentric, right, and institutionally concentrated, often designed very far from the communities who are actually most affected by algorithmic systems. So this presents us with a very unique challenge and an urgent challenge, right, at the intersection of technology, social justice, and development. So here we always, ask in India that how do we build AI systems that are meaningfully inclusive and can be trusted and are accountable to people in the last mile. So this paper basically argues that for any trustworthy AI to thrive, it cannot be delivered to the last mile as a finished product. It must be co-designed with communities grounded in their lived realities, knowledge systems, and everyday interactions with technology. Just to give you a context, this work draws on empirical insights from our work at Digital Empowerment Foundation, and which has worked since 2002 on digital access, bridging digital divide, enabling literacy and entrepreneurship opportunities through digital in rural India. Over the past 2 decades, this is the kind of a network that we have been able to build right across the country with 2,400 rural women entrepreneurs leading community information resource centers across all the 26 states who are enabling access to not just information, which is very important in today's time, critical information, e-governance, welfare schemes, and more. Right, and this is the scale at which it has been able to have that social impact. Why we insist on mentioning this is because this long-term engagement, a very sustained engagement with communities, actually matter, because it allows us to then study AI not as a short-term pilot, but or some experimental interventions that we do, like with changing technologies, with changing advancements, but as something entering already existing community digital ecosystems, right? Which are built on trust, mediation, and local, hyper-local governance. I mean, DF's work is anchored in what I just shared about the Suchnapreneur model. If you break Suchnapreneur, it's information. Suchna means information, and preneur comes from entrepreneur. So it's a digital entrepreneurship model where local women and youth in rural India, they act as trusted digital intermediaries within their own communities, right? And so more like with AI ecosystem, of course, evolving, we have initiatives such as Just AI, data and algorithms for communities, which extend our work into the AI domain. So rather than asking how AI can be deployed in rural or underserved areas, these initiatives, like, we ask a slightly different question. How can community knowledge, values, culture, priorities, histories, how can all of these inform and shape the design, deployment, and evaluation of AI systems themselves? Right? So here we basically, to explain, so this paper basically to explain how this works in practice, this paper draws on several long-running DEF programs as case studies. These are not, this is important to mention here, that these are not AI first projects. They are people first digital development models for India's last mile that now enable participatory AI as well. So one first, like I told you, Suchnapreneur model, which at the heart, it addresses information poverty by creating local information entrepreneurs, primarily women, youth, and also persons with disabilities, who help communities access all of these different kinds of government schemes, health services, education, finance, and also access those grievance redressal mechanisms through digital tools and local language content, right? So this model is very critical for participatory AI, because AI systems in the last mile are never accessed directly, right? They're mediated by trusted people in their communities who translate, who contextualize in the socio-cultural routings and build understanding. So in this sense, Suchnapreneurs already function as social infrastructure for AI, right? And then second, we also take the case study of Smartpur. So Smartpur, like in India, for example, there's a lot of conversation about how to build cities smart, how to make them smart. We rather ask the question, like, how can we build self-sustainable smart villages where we have a village level digital transformation model, which is focused on building self-reliant digital economy, right? So it integrates connectivity, shared digital infrastructure, local institutions, and entrepreneurship opportunities in a single digital ecosystem. So that's the second case study. Third is Udyamani project, which is a women-centric economic empowerment program, which works across agriculture, crafts, handloom, livestock, and other value chains. And this is largely operating in the northeastern region of India, again, which has very specific challenges, demographically speaking. So that's the third case study. And fourth is Internet Roshni. Roshni is light. So Internet Roshni focuses on community managed connectivity in underserved regions. So it demonstrates that access alone does not create participation or trust. Trust emerges when connectivity is locally owned, socially mediated, and embedded in community relationships. So, taken all of these together, like this paper basically argues that participatory AI grows out of long term, people centric digital ecosystems, not standalone AI projects. These, like if you see across these case findings, the research identifies three interlinked outcomes. First, you see that participatory AI reconfigures knowledge hierarchies. Local actors are positioned as epistemic contributors rather than as passive recipients of technological advancements and becoming data points. And second, that participatory processes also strengthen trust. Trust emerges through transparency, vernacular communication, and collective data stewardship, where you have a sense of where your data is going and you have that consciousness that, okay, AI needs algorithms, algorithms needs data sets need our language, history, culture, aspiration. So communities need to be made aware and made data literate to be consciously be part of the AI ecosystem. Third, it enables situated innovation as well. So this includes community curated voice data sets in a way, it's not an extractive way, right, for underrepresented languages, and participatory content moderation frameworks and AI assisted livelihood platforms, which we should co-design again with communities and women and youth, youth in rural India. And so this, I'll stop here because I know we are short of time. So last slide presents some of the constraints that this paper also must highlight. This analysis itself reveals important structural constraints. Sustaining participation in resource-limited ecosystems always is difficult, and tensions always persist between an expert knowledge, which we hold, as a researcher, as a CSO, and then the ecosystems that need to sustain themselves, right? And the lived experiences. So there's always that tension. There's a persistent gap between grassroots participation and national and global AI governance frameworks. We hardly see any, like Jhalak said in the beginning, that CSOs are at the periphery of these conversations and should take center stage because we closely work with communities, but communities themselves should find avenues to be part of our conversations. And addressing this requires a shift from episodic consultation towards an infrastructural model of participation. And this paper situates DEF, DEF's work praxis within the broader debates on localizing AI, making it hyperlocal, decentralized, and arguing that participatory AI in the global south is not just a methodological preference, but an ethical imperative that we need to work towards. So I'll stop here and thank you so much for this opportunity again. Yeah.
Wonderful, thank you. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to add to the spotlight our other panelists who've been in the session, and I'm going to, if I can ask each of you to start your video so I can bring you in. I'm going to put one question to our panelists just to invite them to reflect, and then I'm going to try and pick up some of the questions people have been putting into the document. I think because of our timing, I might need to do things that way rather than getting people to unmute. But we've seen a lot of different perspectives there on participatory AI. If I could ask each of you just to think, particularly in the context of the upcoming summit or global meeting on AI governance, do you have a particular hope for what that could deliver in pushing forwards these kind of ideas, which, as I think Nathan and Megan mentioned, in science sometimes can feel more fringe than they should be. In industry, similarly, can feel an afterthought rather than built in, and can be less visible in the mainstream discourse. What's your hope or ask for the upcoming summit? And then we'll come to some other questions.
You're sharing on the wrong screen, so we've got that kind of.
Okay, yes. I think, Dr. Petrie, if you could stop your screen share, that would help. I think your screen share is coming up still. But maybe, Amin, can I put you on the spot with that question first?
Sorry, I think I got frozen out. Can I get the question again? I'm happy to.
The question is around our hope or ask in the context of the upcoming AI Impact Summit. What do we think might be possible, or might we be seeking there in terms of advancing participatory AI?
I mean, for me, I think a big sort of ask is I see a lot of rhetoric from like governmental channels and research institutions that talk about the notion of building AI for the public good. I mean, India has taken like a putative sort of mantle on building digital public infrastructure, and now they're sort of bringing that same sort of narrative to building AI for the public good. And I feel that a lot of that narrative is driven by well-intentioned terminology, but little to real action on how do you deliver public good through AI systems. Jhalak mentioned about transformative impact, and literally the naming of the summit is impact, because I think it is sort of aligning with this vision of the Indian government that it sees itself as a sort of like a pioneer of like building publicly welfare intention AI systems and sort of deploying them at scale. I will go back to the point I made, which is again coming from my experience, at least, how we have encountered scalability of AI systems in a sector like agriculture, which has a massive sort of digital divide across the global south, both in terms of literacy and accessibility. Scalability cannot happen without adequate trust amongst your end users. And that trust cannot happen without meaningful engagement, where they are not just treated as end user feedback providers to iteratively improve the commercial viability of your product. So for me, like just improving and embedding this sort of nuance into the discourse would be a good step forward towards taking more progressive steps towards actual participation and citizen empowerment.
Fantastic. Maybe Nathan or Megan, if we can come to you next. This is about the discourse, or are there other things we should be seeking?
I can share. My long time effort has been focused on having a world where the tech industry actually bases their claims about the public benefits and the safety of their technologies on real evidence. And right now we live in a time where companies say they're doing experiments, but it means they're unleashing untested technologies onto people and waiting to see what happens. And if they get sued, then maybe fix them. This is, an overstatement, but it is often what occurs. And so, my hope and the drumbeat I often bang is just that if we're going to deploy these systems at scale into people's lives, we actually need to know they work and they're safe. And that means that the science needs to actually include the people who companies say they're here to help. And that would be my hope for the summit. And I know that those aren't things that happen on their own, and it takes collective pressure and organizing to make that happen.
Megan, do you want to build on that? Or?
I mean, yeah, I'll second that absolutely. And then just say that my other probably hope for the summit and really for all of these conversations is just to continue to build this set of examples that we draw on in our paper to show that it is possible and that this is how you do this work in a way that's rigorous, that's science that is useful to folks, in academia or government to advance kind of their work, but that does genuinely and authentically include community voices and does that work. And so just continuing to build out that set of examples of how it can be done, I think is also part of my hope.
Peter, do you want to come in next?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's similar. So India has been positioning itself as a global leader, right, in people-centered, trustworthy AI and digital public infrastructure. But I mean, it is of course fraught with a lot of contradictions and questions, critical questions that one needs to always ask within India and outside. That and the ask definitely is that we should institutionalize community co-design in AI policy at its core, recognizing that last mile communities should be treated as co-creators and not just as data subjects or data points. That is very important. Then we should and must invest in long-term grassroots digital ecosystems than, of course, like scaling innovations after innovations, which are not really demand driven but are rather supply driven, and defining trust in a way that goes beyond technical accuracy, etc., and embeds transparency. Like, for example, just one example, that when we talk about AI ecosystem, one of the conversations that's absolutely not happening, which concerns Global South, is with the rising data centers and the impact on our land, power, water, and everything, our natural habitat, our environment, the socio environment, in fact. So, and changing the future of work. So, there's so many conversations that are not taking place should also come into the fold of the ambit of India AI Impact Summit. Yes, thank you.
Fantastic, and I'm conscious of time, and I've chaired badly in a hybrid mode, trying to pay attention to too many bits at once. But we'll come to our next panel in about 5 minutes. So I think I'm going to try and synthesize one or two of the questions from the document for our panel to respond to, but encourage them also to look. There's some directed specifically to some of you in the doc. But I think we've got a theme on the metrics. How do we ensure that inclusion is not just procedural, but is something that is measurable, and that we're evidencing that we have genuine participatory processes taking place? And if I can maybe link that question to one on the strategies that we should be exploring to tackle either the inaction of institutions in power that are not opening the door to participation, or potentially also to challenge those institutions that are adopting a language of democratization or participation, but without following up with the substance. So whether it's the metrics or strategies, I'm just going to leave open to whoever would like to come in on that now.
Well, I can jump in very briefly. It's not necessarily a very specific metric, but I know in my sort of more cynical moments when I get invited to have these conversations, I geographically am very close to Silicon Valley, and I work for a nonprofit, and so I sometimes feel like I'm sort of the token person who gets invited to some of these meetings in Silicon Valley. And what my advice to them always ends up boiling down to is listen to community members and then believe them. And there isn't sort of a metric for measuring that, but that's the really hard ask, I think, and the thing that very often institutions that want to sort of be able to check this off as something they have done don't necessarily want to do. And I think that's really the harder kind of lift that we have is to really, either convince or just identify the projects where the research that's being done is legitimately interested in listening and believing to the community participation piece.
Yeah. Can I also just quickly add, like, two small points. But I completely agree with Megan. I think like the sort of matrix that we are trying to build using not like novelty methods, but like actual research that shows certain ideas that should go into identification of participants and then evaluate the quality and scope and degree of participation. I think it's really important because I also feel that a lot of, like, just to give an example, uh, I have worked a lot on public policy in the last sort of decade and a half, and not just with respect to AI, but any sort of consultation that tends to typically happen has the same set of people and the same categories of institutions that will find a seat at the table. And increasingly, we are seeing like some sort of a shift towards, okay, we want to bring some sort of community representation in the AI context. We want to bring in some sort of end users' perspectives into it. But it is still at a very nascent stage. End user perspectives in AI are mostly driven by like feedback loops or surveys on the utility of the AI models and their efficiency, but not really as co-creators, as Megan said, or I think Arpita also mentioned, that they're basically utilized as at the end data points to secure further efficiencies rather than actually empower them as co-creators, co-designers, and people who can co-own your AI innovation and like its scaling efforts. So I think a matrix that looks at how participants are identified, how the quality of engagement is measured, and the end objectives would be really useful. We are still trying to figure out how to sort of make it a more robust model, and hopefully we'll have something ready by Feb 18th. But
Oh, Peter, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, just adding to all of the agreed points that in India, what we see is the rise of new labor force called the data workers, and they're all like digitally illiterate rural citizens who are given the manual task of labeling and categorizing things that they don't even relate to culturally, right? And so it's complete alienation of labor as well. So what kind of uh, entire economy that's getting built, what kind of precedents are we setting for society, for an economic system, for any establishment? Like we are built on, so the idea of security, safety, trust, every quarter is using, government is using those words, big tech is using those words, CSO is using those words, but they have, the meaning of these important words get lost when everyone just uses them very casually, without. So we have to really go behind and understand how do how do different stakeholders actually define this, and do they actually center communities, in these conversations. So yeah, I mean, that's all, I think.
Wonderful. Well, thank you to our first panel for really setting us up there with a frame for some of the themes we'll be exploring at Pairs, and already many ideas that I think can go into some of our recommendations to the summit. I'm going to hand now over to Asta to chair our next panel. So if you're on camera, I will pop you up on screen. And in this next panel, we're going to be starting to look at the question of who participates. And while you introduce that, Asta, I'll get Octavia set up, who'll be presenting from here in London, and I think our other presenters are online.
Thanks, Tim, and thank you so much for that fantastic panel. As Tim mentioned, I think in this particular set, we're going to be talking about participation for whom. I think that we all get really embroiled in like, oh, there should be community participation. Yes, we should be inclusive. But then when we start to get into the sort of weeds of who gets involved through these processes and how these processes are not just check boxes, is where things get a little bit more complicated. We also need to think about how we can look at different parts of inclusion, especially from the perspective of the Global South. And we will hear some of these presentations as we go along this particular panel. We will look at different aspects of this notion of inclusion, which is, how do we think about it in the majority world, as I said, what are the assumptions that we have about inclusion, and what are the processes that already exist and how those can be enveloped into what we're trying to do with digital technologies and AI, and how do we really reckon with notions of power within all of this. So with that, I will invite panelists to make brief, remarks about their paper and title. We'll give everybody like 4 or 5 minutes to go through it, and then, get into more of a conversation around this. So first is Octavia, with a paper on attitudinal research on AI, which is work that the Ada Lovelace Institute does so phenomenally out of London. Octavia, over to you.
Thank you so much, Esther, and thank you for that kind comment about our work. I'm going to talk about the value and challenges of producing public attitudes research about AI. So just to locate ourselves, we're thinking at the policy end of the socio-technical process of AI development. I'll be making the case for why quant research is an important component in involving people in AI development and deployment, not just expert engineers or professional users or AI researchers, but a range of people from different backgrounds with different expertise based on their own experiences who may be positively or negatively affected. And really about the potential to design quantitative studies to be more inclusive by using participatory concepts drawn from democratic theory. So I'm going to use evidence from the UK because that's the context that Ada's working in. I really hope it's relevant to people from other contexts, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from different perspectives on the panel as well. But first, if we can, let's just look at some evidence from our recent polling that will help us to think about representation. You can find this evidence on Ada's website in a policy briefing called Great Public Expectations. So we know we do a biennial attitude survey, and we know that people have varied views about different uses of AI that differ by demographic. The one thing that this new polling tells us is that they don't feel represented by government. 60% of the UK public do not feel that people like them have a say in what the government does. And this feeling of disempowerment is higher if you're older, it's higher if you're a woman, it's higher if you're less digitally confident, if you have a lower level of overall education, and if you live outside of the capital city. So there are some things that we know about representation. The research also shows that people have really clear values and wishes when it comes to how AI is governed in their interests. So when we ask, is it important that AI systems are developed and used in ways that treat people fairly? 91% of people agree. And they can think about complexity and trade-offs. So 89% of people agree that AI products and services should not be rolled out until they're proven safe, even if this slows things down. 74% agree that some uses of AI should be restricted or banned on ethical or social grounds, even if they bring economic benefits. And 84% are concerned that the government putting technology sector needs ahead of the public when regulating AI. Sorry, I didn't say that right. Concerned about the government putting technology sector needs ahead of the public when regulating AI. And this figure holds true across age, across digital confidence, across gender, and across feelings of political empowerment. But most importantly, in the context of experiences of disempowerment, 72% indicated that laws and regulations would increase their comfort with AI technologies. And this is up from 62% when we last asked, which was in 2023. So these figures are all statistically high. We have some confidence in them. They're also significantly out of step with what the UK government has said about its priorities for AI and its current appetite for legislation. So as we've seen this week, with the scramble to respond to an AI nudification function, I'm going to try and reference this story without naming the brand, but I think you all know what I'm talking about. Makes it easy to post unauthorized sexualized images to social media. The UK government has promised to ban dedicated nudification apps, but not general purpose systems with this capability. So AI technologies are continuing to develop more rapidly than policy guardrails. And this brings us to the second point, which is how you represent people's views into AI policy making meaningfully in ways that redistribute power in an environment where technology companies are able to make decisions about products' capabilities without legal safeguards. So these technologies are constantly being remade, technology uses and how they affect different people are constantly shifting, and participation needs to be remade to balance changes both in technical innovation and in political authority. There isn't one way to do participation, and how you do it matters. And it may seem unusual to be talking about participatory methods in relation to quantitative surveys, but we see this work as critical now for two reasons. So the first reason is because policymakers find it easier to pay attention to this kind of large-scale, nationally representative attitudinal evidence than the smaller qualitative studies that provide rich descriptions of people's experiences and motivations. And secondly, because we know from our own experience that it's really difficult to represent the perspectives of minoritized groups in these studies because of how surveys are funded, or the way that survey companies compose their panels, or constraints of different survey design and analysis paradigms. The data I gave you on how represented people feel doesn't say anything about minority ethnic communities. That's not because we didn't want to, it's because of limitations to who we could sample. So you can see that there's something really important happening here. And in short, that is that surveys are a form of evidence that's legible to policy and has representation issues. And that's really what we're interested in. So just to close, I want to point you to the paper that Roshni Modvadia will be presenting at Pairs in Delhi in February. It explores how concepts of participation drawing from social and democratic theory and practice can be applied to survey methodology to better achieve equity and inclusion and help mitigate participatory inequalities. So it examines critical approaches to quant analysis that use frameworks referencing systems of power and oppression. It's an emergent but under-theorized component of participatory and inclusive practice in survey work. And it points to an intersectional analytical approach that may be more resilient to these common challenges that we have in survey data, such as small sample sizes. So this is novel research about emerging practices. We're bringing together disparate strands of research to think holistically about these more equitable and inclusive ways of doing quantitative public attitude surveys. We're keen to be part of building a community around this of researchers who are interested in questions about how we do this and how to communicate it effectively. So if that sounds like you, please do get in touch. And thank you very much again for giving me the opportunity to talk here.
Thank you so much, Octavia, and thank you so much for bringing into the fore a methodology that is often deployed but not always understood. So thank you for that. We will move to the next paper, which is going to take us to Latin America, where we will have Jose and Sasha talking about experiences of participatory AI governance from Brazil and Chile. Especially interested because I don't know for those who know, but Lula is going to be in Delhi for the AI summit, and this is likely going to be hopefully the start of more global South collaboration between the two countries, but approaches that are obviously very different. And I saw Jose, you're also going to be touching upon like the pulls on global South countries, which is like innovation on one end, and then contextual sort of context, local context on the other. So excited to hear it.
Thank you. Well, I'm Jose. I'm from Chile. Just also for context, I'm a PhD candidate at Cornell. Sacha cannot be here now because time difference. She's in California, so it's like 6 a.m. now there. But she will be in Delhi also presenting. Where our project starts and also like kind of our exploration is like before being PhD students, we both have worked in AI policy and governance as practitioners. I was part of the government in Chile. She was also part of international organizations. So we've been dealing with a lot of like the more practical challenges of actually implementing participatory processes in AI governance processes. And in that sense, one tension, especially when we're discussing regulation in the last few years, I would say, it's how can we deal with the tension of having like global principles or global approaches and ethical frameworks, or for instance, like the European AI Act and like all the influence that it does outside of Europe. But at the same time, how can we adapt governance structures into the reality of the global South and in our case in Latin America? So we're different countries with very different legal frameworks and approaches, but also there's like a lot of tension between what AI can do and how can we govern AI at the same time. And many times actually like the public, just before like the last presentation was about the sentiment, like the sentiment is different because there's like a lot of hope on what technology can do in emerging economies. So in that sense, one thing that we were really interested is how can we navigate participatory process in a more pragmatic way when there's like a lot of chaos in different contexts, and how and when to do, for instance, more flexible approaches and more structured approaches for AI governance. And in that sense, we were drawing from two cases. We're still figuring out some things of the data, but one of them is the case of Chile, in which we had long participatory process to create our national AI strategy. And then also a different one, but we also had like another participatory processes in which we collaborate with UNESCO to update the national AI strategy. And one thing that happened in the case of Chile, it was that it was a very unstructured and not like not necessarily academic or very well or nor using like a specific framework for participation. Rather, it was like a more flexible approach that had to adapt to many crises in the 2 years that kind of covered the process. And we want to compare that more flexible but at the same time chaotic approach to the one that like delivered polling can propose, in the sense that having mini publics, like a structured random sample in which you can have representative a representative sample deliberating with a structured support of that can fight misinformation and can provide information from experts. And we want to, what we're doing is analyzing how both cases can contribute to decide whether and how to design participatory process in for AI governance. So this is not necessarily thinking about like a specific AI applications. It's more like about the broader like AI governance framework of a country. And in that context, just like some things that we've seen is that especially when there's like high instability and there's like a lot of things happening at the political level, many times it's more structured approaches are really hard to implement, and many times they can lead just to high hopes, but then a lot of disappointments in the end. Because, for instance, when we had the case of Chile, we had during the process of deliberation for the policy, social riots tried to change the constitution, two attempts to change the constitution which failed, and then and also the COVID pandemic. All that happened in 2 3 years. So what we had to do from the government is actually to shape that participatory process to adapt to first the social riots, then to COVID, to allow more people to participate. And at the same time, and this is something I think Nathan mentioned at the beginning, like in the context of science, but also happened in the context of governance, there's a lot of push from experts saying that like lay people should not participate because they don't know anything about AI. That's something that we were told many times, which I don't agree. And in that sense, it was like a flexible approach in which the most of the resources and the teams were deployed basically to be able to have the broadest possible participation and at the same time to enable different types of community to participate. And in that sense, for instance, there were like not expert-led structured resources to support misinformation or disinformation. It was actually much more basic. Times of the pandemic, for instance, like how to use Zoom to connect and deliberate. And then like these are like guiding questions in very, very simple words on how can you think about AI in your life? And this is before ChatGPT, so it's like not everyone was thinking about AI. Well, what we are analyzing now with what could happen in Brazil, but also maybe in some other contexts of deliberative polling, is like what happens when you have the resources and when you can actually do something more structured, and you have more stability in a sense in which you can actually deploy something that is more legitimate if it's actually achieved in the end. So that's kind of a preview of what we will be presenting. Is like when one or the other approach can be helpful, but also our idea and why we think this matters is to be more pragmatic in how we implement participatory processes. And it's like we cannot always empower to the extent we want. We don't always have the resources we would wish to, but then we can still do participation if we are transparent about the goals, transparent about the level of engagement we can offer, and then how that translates actually into impact in the policy making process.
Thank you so much, Jose. And I really appreciate, I think, the coming from complexities of the global south, that we just have to be pragmatic and inefficient about the way that we participate. We can't be hung up on a lot of process and fanfare. So really do appreciate that. I wanted to just call out if Liz or Rembo is on the call. We have been trying to find Okay. In case Liz comes up later, then please do let me know on chat. But I will move to Fedat Abdullahi, who will be talking about perspectives from Global South as well, and looking at Nigeria, Kenya, and a broader lens on the African Union. So over to you.
Hello, everyone. It's lovely to be here today. I'm Faidat Abdullahi. I'm from Nigeria. I'm a senior policy advisor at the Africa Digital Inclusion Alliance, which is a nonprofit based in Nairobi, Kenya, and committed to advancing digital inclusion across Africa. My paper asks what I think is a fundamental question. Is AI governance truly participatory when the people most impacted by AI are systematically excluded from shaping it? Right now, we're at this critical moment where countries across Africa and the wider global south are developing national AI strategies. But there's an assumption embedded in most participatory governance approaches that people have baseline digital access. But the reality is, millions of people lack reliable connectivity or digital literacy or speak indigenous languages that are not represented in these forums. And when we conduct AI governance consultations, primarily through online portals, expert panels, or digital submissions, we're systematically excluding marginalized voices in developing these strategies. And the risk in that is we would further widen the digital divide, which is already at a critical point. And participation mechanisms are built on connectivity, literacy, language, and institutional access. And without this, participation becomes more symbolic and power isn't properly distributed. So what I've done in this paper is build a framework to evaluate whether countries are actually designing participation that accounts for structural inequity. So it adapts a popular framework used in participatory governance called the Democracy Cube by Atron Fong. And so it synthesizes it with digital inclusion indicators and adapts it for participatory AI governance. And so what the framework does is it asks three key questions. And the first is, what gets selected to participate? Are we doing anything about the infrastructure gaps that keep a large part of the population out? And the second is, how are people communicating their input? Are we going through trusted local intermediaries? Are we using indigenous languages? Are we meeting people where they are, instead of expecting them to come to us? And the third is one I think is quite critical. Do these communities actually have the power to shape AI outcomes, or are we just ticking boxes? So what I do in the paper is apply this framework to three cases: the African Union Continental Strategy, Nigeria's AI strategy, and Kenya's 2025 to 2030 AI strategy. So my initial findings show that these strategies do mention digital literacy and infrastructure, but primarily as enablers of AI deployment, not as prerequisites for inclusive AI governance. And I also identify significant gaps in the engagement of populations that lack baseline connectivity. So I'll expand more on this, of course, during the Paris presentation in February. But the risk here is that AI governance that doesn't account for digital inequity will deepen existing digital divides. And the pervasive influence of AI in our lives across healthcare, employment, justice, education, and other fields means that we cannot deprioritize truly inclusive governance approaches. Because if we're serious about participatory AI governance, we need to first ask, who is missing from the conversation and how do we truly include them? So that's the quick 3 to 4 minute summary of what my paper is about. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much for that. We've been tracking some of the questions in the conversation, but maybe I'll just ask one also to repeat a little bit from the expectations from the previous panel, which is that, you know, as we sit through some of these perspectives, well, two papers from the Global South, but also Octavia's on methodologies. I would love to understand if you guys have a sense of, one is in this like methodological eclecticism, what works in some ways, and both of you talked about like meeting people where they are. So how do we do that with a much more international perspective? Because I think the summits are this moment for collaboration, and then leaning into that, which is that as the Global South, looking into the India AI Summit, are there any big thoughts or expectations, particularly from this lens? And I'll go into maybe the other questions thereafter.
Who did you want to answer that, Asta?
Maybe Octavia, you could start, and we could just do a very quick round.
Yeah, so as I understand it, the question you're asking is thinking about the particular context that we're working in and the challenges there and how they may be different to, but also where we might be able to translate over into other jurisdictions. And I was thinking as I was listening to Jose and Fidat that we're in very different contexts with very different challenges. The challenges that we face in the UK are often about entrenched positions, entrenched knowledges that policymakers hold, and trying to get those to shift is actually very difficult. That's a lot of the work that we're doing. For me, the answer is about this sort of ecologization of participatory methods. So not coming to this, with a normative kind of, you should be doing this, you have to be doing this, you have to be doing it in this circumstance, but much more, there are all of these ways of doing things, there are all of these methods, there's all this evidence about how and where and differently how it can work well, and really raising awareness about these, as well as taking down some of those barriers where people, for various political or other reasons, just don't want to involve people. So a combination of pushing the mechanisms, but also being very honest and open, as some of the other speakers said, about the pragmatism of it and using the right methods in the right context.
Jose, you want to go
I can
next?
go.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I think that's kind of where I can follow actually. But yeah, one thing that I wanted to say, and following the same line, I think there's a lot about like how we can adapt different like normative or like more like existing frameworks to the context, that to be like as context specific as possible, but at the same time as flexible as possible. And that's considering especially in emerging countries in the global south, like how unstable many of these countries are. And many times it's not thinking of participation just as a way of incorporating everyone and like hearing all the voices, but also seeing that as like a more practical tool to actually be able to navigate the politics of governance. And that is actually something that we saw in the case of Chile, where one of the main concerns when developing the national AI strategy was how that strategy and policy could survive from one government to the next. Because one of the main concerns was always like, if we change the color of the government, then everything will die and they will just start over. And actually participation on the one hand had like the objective of gathering diverse voices and have like all these voices into the policy and make it as legitimate as possible. But at the same time, it was thought as a way of actually like a more strategic way of having more increasing the political cost to whoever the next government was, to actually just discard the policies. Like the broader the process was, it was like there are more voices and these voices are saying one thing, and then it's harder to just say we are not considering the policy anymore, we are doing something new. And actually there was like a lot of things happening during the process which led to not killing the strategy, but actually taking it and just adapting it to the next government, even though we changed from one side to the other side. But in part of that was because a lot of the people that then assumed into the new government were part of this process as opposition, as critics, but they were part of it. So it kind of helped to transition into the next government, and instead of just like going and starting from scratch, it was like we have something, let's build up on it. And it's been the experience, for instance, in Chile, but also in other countries like Uruguay, where they also had participation, but it wasn't the case in other cases, I don't know, with the first strategy in Mexico or in Argentina, where they didn't necessarily have these processes, and the new governments actually discarded the previous policies and started new ones. So just to wrap up the comment, I think, especially in the global south, where we have like more turbulent politics sometimes, but this is something that it's, I think, in everywhere in the world now. We can think of like, participation also as a way of navigating the politics, like from the bottom up, and helping these policies to become like a space of consensus rather than just something that is just to gather information.
Yeah, and I think I'll follow from what Octaviano Zay said. It's pretty much very similar context when we're discussing global South countries. And I think the key is recognizing that there's no one size fits all for to participatory AI governance, right? Different contexts require different forms of participation. So in communities where there's strong digital connectivity, you might use online consultations and digital platforms effectively, and that works, right? But in contexts with limited connectivity, like the context I've researched, in lots of different countries in Africa, meaningful participation requires not just one singular method or constitution exercise. It's expensive, it's slow, and it requires infrastructure investment. You need to build capacity, you need to build political commitment, and have ongoing practices that are truly embedded across the AI lifecycle. So we need to explicitly, resource participation as part of AI governance. I think that's something that's very important for countries in the global south. It can't just be an aside, right? We have to be intentional. We have to provide funding, provide time, provide institutional support for participatory processes to make sure they are accessible to marginalized communities. And that includes support for things like translation, local facilitation, and true community-led engagement.
I really appreciate that, and maybe that is something that we sort of can actually write out as a call for one of these summits, is that we need to resource participation in a meaningful way. We're changing tactics here. You're all allowed to unmute yourselves, and so if you could raise your hands in case you have questions. I see some in the documents, but if you would like to just raise your hands, and I can call on you for any questions to the panel, and we can take it from there. Yeah, Renee, go for it.
Okay, so I'll be provocative. Hi, everyone from snowy Canada. How can we ensure that participatory AI does not become a vehicle for white supremacy?
Is that addressed at anyone in particular, or anyone could go?
Nope, everyone, because we're all a part of this.
Yeah. Jose, you want to go? Oh, sorry, please, Fade, please.
Oh yes, I was going to say, I think the important thing here is to ensure that we're doing participation with the people, versus just giving them what we think they need. And I think this is something that we've seen a lot in our work with the Africa Digital Inclusion Alliance. Is there are people who and I wouldn't want to use the language white saviorism. They sort of come in and they believe that this is what the community needs. But a lot of the time what you're doing is transposing what has worked for you in your global north country to the global south, to these communities, and it's very different. You could go to communities where you have to sort of sell them on why any sort of digital connectivity is even important, it's even of value to them. So I would say one way to ensure that it's not a vehicle for white supremacy is to make sure that it's coming from the community, not just trickling from global north to global south, but actually engaging with the people in those communities, hearing from them, speaking their language, and building, co-creating with them. That's the summary.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Octavia.
I can build on that a bit. I mean, I really appreciate the question. In a way, I think you could put, anything in any media vehicle into that space where you're saying participatory AI, to become a vehicle for white supremacy, any kind of supremacy. And I agree with Fidat that it's not the technology that we're worrying about here. It's who holds the power. That's the thing that makes the difference. And my optimism about these sorts of participatory methods is that meaningful participation with diverse affected communities, if you're really drawing in those perspectives and you're really listening to them, then that is part of the answer to that question. It's not the only answer. So I would sort of try optimistically to flip it around a bit.
Jose, you want to
Yes,
go?
yeah, just to, yeah, I was going to say actually something a little similar to Tia, but just to add on that, I'd say, um, so one thing that I'd say is like be very transparent about what the goals and what actually can be achieved in the process, and this goes again back to like a more pragmatic approach. Not all the time we can do like participatory budget and like have like a very like incorporate people as much as we can. Many times that's not possible, but we can do something and sometimes that's better than nothing. Sometimes not. Sometimes actually participation can be just whitewashing and participatory washing and can be actually worse. So that's one thing, but be very transparent. And that's something that, at least in our case in Chile, worked in as we could do. For instance, we did like two stages of participation, in which one was like a deliberation, then consultation. And basically it was designed in a way so that the second stage was able to look at the first one and see, these are all the things you said. These are what we as the government are saying. Tell us very publicly what you agree or not with how we are interpreting all the things you said. And then like being very transparent in saying like these are the things we consider, these are the things that we couldn't. So that's one thing. And the other thing is like, and this is more broadly, I would say, I would phrase it differently, maybe because I'm Latin America and we usually we don't speak about like white supremacists as much. That's a very now that I'm studying the US, I hear a lot. That's not necessarily something that happened a lot in Latin America. Not with that framing, but yes, in a framing of like the global, like global North, global South, which is different. And in that sense, we are much more worried, for instance, about how like the European way of regulating is like trying to permeate, and it's like a regulatory like colonization many times on how we are going to regulate or not AI, for instance. But at the same time, we see like who is developing, and that's a different way of like pushing and Latin America, and particularly Chile, is like in this tension, for instance, between China and the US, and it's like a very complex social like geopolitical context in that sense. And I think participation there can play a very important role in how we can take these international tensions into actually going to the community and saying, what do we want as a country? What do we want in like our own identity? And to what point can we influence like these discussions? So it's like we are not probably not developing like the largest models in the future, but we can actually, and it's something that I saw in the notes, but we can actually push and a process in which we can develop, for instance, like a Latin American LLM that is called like Latam GPT, that is led by the Chilean National AI Center, but it's collecting and like data, for instance, in a different way from other LLMs with donations and in a way that actually is very participatory. And it's like this is not necessarily meant to be competing like existing LLMs, but it's like showing that there's an alternative way of creating AI that is more contextualized, but at the same time, it's also showing that we can develop also different metrics and show how in the specific context it can actually outperform like the top models in some tasks that are more context specific. And that's part of these policies on how we discuss how we can adapt the things that we're having outside to our own context.
Pedro, are you raising your hand, or is that a legacy
Add
hand?
something quickly to that. You know, from the African perspective, we speak a lot about decolonizing AI to ensure that it's not, you know, that when we are using AI in our context, it represents our communities and our societies and isn't just a direct copy or reflection of contexts that don't work for us.
Yeah, I was going to put this in the chat as well, is like how do we make sure that like in this context of participation, we're also managing the majorities, which often become the louder voices in some of these processes. Does anyone else have a question that they'd like to direct at the panelists, or I can go also in the chat. Please do raise your hands if you do have a question.
Can I say something about what you just said?
Yeah.
So just a quick comment, and this is part also of the design and what I was saying about transparency in the process. I think one of the things we're saying, at least in our paper, is like this, like what's the role of participation in the policy building process? And if we want representation, that's a completely different thing from like deliberation. And with one the representative deliberative process, that's kind of the most structured, like deliberative polling poll. It's very different from like building other like raising like marginalized voices in which we're not necessarily looking for representation or majorities. We're actually like going into like the spaces that are usually unheard. And I think being transparent on how all the different inputs come into place to then design a policy is very important, but then also knowing which ones are like more representative, when majority is a thing, or when or be also very conscious on how self-selected many of these processes are.
And then I think also related to that, it's how do we navigate some of the political structures around some of this in especially tricky contexts where it's not very straightforward. Octavia, anything from you, particularly given that methods such as surveys do tend to aggregate certain kind of majoritarian views. So how do we balance out some of those things methodologically?
Yeah, absolutely. And we've done a lot of work. As I mentioned, Roshni Madhvadia leads this work at Ada, and she's done a lot of work trying to work within the ecosystem of what's possible in terms of quantitative surveys in the UK. And it's really difficult, and it's not something that is particularly surfaced when people are thinking about the authority of this kind of information. In the UK, it's very accepted in UK policy that these types of quantitative studies give you a sort of truth, and they give you a better truth than the qualitative studies. It's much harder to get people in the UK to listen, to get decision makers in the UK to listen to qualitative studies. And that's really what we're picking up with this research, is saying, well, you like the quant, and that's great that you like it, and you're misunderstanding what it's doing. So we need to unpack what it's actually doing, and we need to change as much as we can the ecosystem around how you produce those studies in order to really enable it to underpin the kind of evidence-based policy making that we still think that we should have in this country. But it's a very hard conversation to have, and what we try to do is to, as much as possible, lean into the narrative of ask people what they think because it's important to know what they think, rather than ask people what they think because if you don't, you'll lose public trust. And it's that second one that really has the leverage. People, talk a lot about examples like genetically modified GMOs, the genetically modified foods. And what happens here in Europe was that there were public dialogues about that. People really did come together and share their thoughts. Those dialogues produced really good evidence about public concerns, so not just about whether the technology was safe, but also broader societal questions. What were the systemic effects of patents, how people in poorer communities were going to be affected. But that evidence didn't land, and the biotech companies managed to just assume that people were against these GMOs because they didn't understand the science. And what happened with that, as we know, is that we're still here. I'm not advocating for GMOs, by the way, but we're still here 20 years later. With the technologies have moved on. Companies are still trying to rebuild that public trust that was lost at that point. And that's a narrative that we can tell that's reasonably legible to policymakers, because it speaks to the importance of public evidence in maintaining trust in their power. It's much harder here to talk about pulling forward evidence of communities and what they think, and making that legible to decision makers.
Thank you so much to the panelists, and also to the group for questions that you answer. I mean, it was such a rich discussion, and often conversations that are so dense don't come away with like specific solutions, but I think we've been noting those down as well. I'll pass it back to Tim for the next steps on the program.
Right, now I'll run back up to the front where hopefully you can hear me again. So what we're going to do now, and thank you to all our panelists and everyone who's been adding to our collaborative document, because we really want this as a pre-summit event to come out with some of those kind of sense of where can we take work into the summit as an opportunity space, and where can we use pairs as our own community space as strategically, as effectively, as supportively as possible to us all. So I'm going to give just 5 or 6 minutes for, if there's program committee members who've been thinking about this and looking at all the work, who would like to give their 60 seconds sort of reflection on either how the AI Impact Summit could advance participatory approaches to AI, or maybe how pairs could contribute to that. Invite you to share brief remarks on that. I didn't give them much pre-warning, so some may or may not want to do that. And then we're going to go into some online and in-the-room breakout groups for discussion. I'm aware some people may have to leave us at the sort of top of the hour or half hour, depending on where you are. But we want to really get your inputs into this too. To start that off, I thought I'd just share my own reflections hearing the discussions, which was really about the importance of us coming away or feeding into that summit something about rigorous methods for genuinely empowering participation in the context of a complex technology. And I'm left with this question: are we democracy scholars and activists? Are we technology scholars and activists? Or what is the very specific intersection of getting people to talk about where technology is affecting their lives in a very power-aware way? So what is it that we can do, particularly through pairs, of sharpening our methods, sharpening our critique of our participatory methods, to make sure we're not doing participation washing, that we have mechanisms to protect against participation washing, and to call out work that is engaging with the language of participation, but not the substance, but also to promote that work that's engaging with the substance. So that's where I'm starting from, trying to think, how does that become something concrete? That's the challenge for the breakout groups. But is there any others who want to share their initial reflections on everything they've heard and the thoughts in their head? If I can get you just to unmute yourselves, if so, or raise your hands if you would like to.
Hi, it's Ned here. I was just thinking about building off what you were talking about, Tim, the importance of rigorous methods, or rather methods that reflect that aren't sort of participation washing and reflect the interests of participants. There also something came out for me from a lot of the talks, including Jose talking about some of the policymakers he's talked to, Nathan talking about forms of participatory evaluation, but particularly Octavia at the end talking about the different emphasis on quantitative versus qualitative forms of research in the UK. Just like the forms that participatory work shows up and gets recognised really matters, I think. Like to think about the forms in which we present participatory work to decision makers, making sure that we balance, like ensuring that evidence informs decision makers, but also reflects participant interest, I think is something that I'm going to think about more as we go to the summit, but also the pairs workshop.
Fantastic. Susan, I see you're unmuted. Did you want to come in with brief reflections? Anyone from the room who wants to take that invite? If not, what we will do is get into those breakout groups, because I think that's our opportunity to be in discussion. So what we should be set up online to move to some breakouts. I'm just going to put on screen the question that we're asking you all to consider. Just give me one moment to do that. So what we're going to ask you to do as you go into breakout rooms is to first have a chance to introduce yourself. It feels bad in a participatory session to be a couple of hours in before we give you a chance to really talk to each other. The limitations of the format, please forgive us. But have a chance just go around your group, introduce yourself, anything that struck you so far, and then have that discussion on, from your perspective, what are the most important considerations for participatory AI to contribute to inclusion and social empowerment. These are key themes of the Impact Summit. And then capture in the document, your breakout room should have a number. There should be a heading in the document. Ask either someone to scribe or put your own notes in there of what would you like to see the AI Impact Summit do to advance participatory AI. And we'll use all of that to shape our output report from this session. I think as we're running a few minutes ahead, we'll open those breakout rooms now, and we'll close them at about 10 past the hour or 20 to the hour, realizing we're with India a half-hour offset, which gets me very confused every time I'm trying to work that out. But we'll have about 20 minutes for those breakouts, I think, if I've got that right, and we'll send messages through. Yeah, those breakout rooms are opening now. Please do go into them here in the room. People find space and mute.